Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to the 12th class in Understanding Contemporary Art. And this time what I'd like to do is talk about the relatively obscure artist known as Paul Thek, who I've grouped in here with the pop artist, even though he's not technically speaking a pop artist at all. But in an interesting sense, I think his work amounts to a kind of critique of pop art. He's a kind of anti-pop artist. He regarded what the pop artists such as Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg were doing, as well as the minimalists such as Donald Judd, as kind of shallow and trivial and spiritually empty. And Thek had a very different sensibility. He's become obscure. There was an exhibition, a retrospective, the first American retrospective of his works recently in 2010 at the Whitney, and since then he's becoming better and better known. He's always been known to the artists, though, as we'll see. Damien Hirst drew inspiration from him, as we'll see, and Mike Kelly and some other artists. So we'll take a look at his works, and we'll go ahead and move right into it. Here is a photograph of him from 1963 when he went with the photographer Peter Hujar to Sicily, and they went to the catacombs, and here's him standing. This is Paul Thek standing in the catacombs, surrounded by death, basically. And this had a pretty big impact on him, and the idea occurred to him that it might be possible to use the human body to disassemble it and to use the pieces of it to construct works of art. Basically, he thought it would be interesting to decorate a room with pieces of the human body. And I think here that just as with Andy Warhol, there is a certain parallel with Warhol in his death cult that was inaugurated by, as we've seen in his death and disaster paintings. He was essentially creating a cult of the dead, using this, mummifying the celebrity, basically, with his silk screens. Here, too, Paul Thek begins by creating his own cult of the dead and going back to New York City when he began to exhibit his famous, what are known as his meat pieces, and what later become known as technological reliquaries, as he terms them later. Here, they're just called meat pieces, and this is an interesting one here. This is Meat Piece with Flies from 1965, and it's made out of, it's basically a hunk of meat swarming with flies, but it's made out of substances like wax and resin, and it's on the inside of a sort of formalist Donald Judd-like cube, a plexiglass container. Clearly, this became the inspiration for Damien Hirst's later work, as we see here, 1,000 Years, which is has a cow's head with flies swarming over it, an actual real cow's head on the inside of a vitrine that he did in 1990 and was clearly inspired by Thek's work. Also, Thek's work has a dig in at the minimalism, as we see here, of Donald Judd. This is Judd's Untitled, 1968, a plexiglass cube. And Paul Thek's work basically regards the minimalism in pop art as something shallow and trivial. But basically, as we've seen, what pop art was doing was essentially shallow in a certain respect. It had to do with grabbing the iconotypes of mass consumer culture and exhibiting them and showing how they had replaced the semiotic vacancies that had been left by the deconstruction of the West's great iconotypes, the religious iconotypes. But Paul Thek, in his work, is essentially concerned with digging up the world's cultural, religious, and mythical iconotypes, digging them up, de-worlding them by taking them from their original world horizons, their original context in the various civilizations that they emerged in an almost Jungian manner, and then crossing them and hybridizing them into strange, unprecedented, new combinations that are very interesting and are part of, I think, in Thek's work, a quest to find new forms to create currents that will catalyze spiritual energy. I think that's very much what he's after here. Here is his comment on Andy Warhol's Brillo box. This is Meat Piece with Brillo box of 1965. He's essentially taken the Brillo box and turned it onto its side and given it an interior. In doing that, he's basically saying that the Brillo box is a shallow, empty thing to do, but he puts an interior, a visceral interior here with this wax interior of the human body that gives it depth and almost evokes the ancient myth of Osiris, who, as we'll see again later at the end here, it was in the original Egyptian myth, was cut up, torn to pieces, and each of the pieces of his body was thrown into a different location. Sort of what he's doing here with these early exhibitions in New York, these meat pieces, is a sort of Zerrissenheit or disassemblage of the human meat body, what's known in the ancient traditions as the meat body, or the body of Osiris, where the pieces are scattered hither and thither. But he's trying to give depth. He's trying to create a counter environment to pop art and give it some depth, create a kind of compensatory world that gives it an interior to it by putting pieces, chunks of the human soma into the inside of works like the Brillo box here. This is a very strange work here, too. This is called Four-Tube Meat Pie of 1964. And the question now here becomes, I think, Tech was one of the first, I think, to introduce into art the anti-object. What this object is cannot be explained. It isn't anything, and it has no explanation. And so really for the first time, he's introducing the concept of an anti-object. It's just a chunk with four tubes sticking out of it inside of a cage. And the anti-object, which will be embraced later on by artists like Damien Hirst to some extent, and also Anish Kapoor, is an object that has no known meaning. It doesn't refer to anything, and all meanings and attempts to make meaning stick to it, sort of slide off. It almost looks like a science fictional object, and indeed, it may have been the inspiration for some of the imagery that we saw recently in Brandon Cronenberg's film Antiviral. Now this is the warrior's arm of 1966 or 67 thereabouts. And clearly he's basically taken one of the great figures in the Western tradition, one of the great warriors out of the Iliad that are shod with greaves, and he's breaking the warrior up, the image of the Homeric warrior, and fragmenting it, and it becomes a kind of fetish object. It's as though he were breaking these signifiers of the Western tradition into pieces and examining them as fetish objects in quest of a new cosmology. First, he has to disassemble the human body, break it up into pieces in order to find the cosmology that he will then begin to suture together. And he's still in the sort of Osirian mode of pulling the body apart, as we see here also with the warrior's arm from about the same period, which is made out of wax and is a wonderful piece that has a kind of Lacanian partial object aspect to it. Now, long about in the late 60s, not long about 1968, he created a work, and this work is lost. It's called The Tomb, and it's his most famous work. And apparently what he did was he created a pink ziggurat, and a ziggurat is itself the equivalent of the pyramid from Mesopotamia. It's a great religious edifice for walking up to the top and communing with the gods. The gods come down to the top of the ziggurat. And then the Mesopotamians, though, unlike the Egyptians, did not bury their dead on the insides of the ziggurats, as Paul Tech did here with this ziggurat that he made. He made a pink ziggurat. And the ziggurats come from the Mesopotamian tradition. But Paul Tech, what I want to point out is that Paul Tech is one of the great fashioners, one of the great originators of the installation. And here's a work, here in this photograph by Peter Hujar, we see him creating the effigy of himself out of wax that he put on the inside of it. And so we don't know what the outside looked like because it's been lost, but it might have looked something like this. This is a photograph that survives of a later work of his from 1973 called Arc Pyramid, where we can see once again there's a sort of rabbit sitting on a hill, and it looks like there's a kind of sand ocean, a pyramid in the background, and his ziggurat that he buried himself inside of in the tomb in 1968 might have resembled that. And there's a sort of arc along the side. And one can begin to sense then why he felt that pop art and formalism and the formalism of minimalist art was so shallow, because for Tech it was about religious signifiers, removing them, de-worlding them from their contexts in all the world's great metaphysical and mythological systems, and hybridizing them, genetically splicing them together, which is something that Damien Hirst, as we'll see later, does, especially in his later works, as we'll see. Now, after the tomb, he sort of resurrected himself in a work called Fishman of 1968. The interesting thing about the tomb is that you have to be careful as an artist what you do, because basically the tomb, he sort of buried himself, and in a sense it was the end of his art career in New York, because after the tomb he left New York for Europe, where he was very popular. His works, his various installations and combinations of found objects were a great success in Europe. But when he returned to New York in 1976, nobody knew who he was. He had been completely forgotten. And it was almost as though the tomb really was celebrating his death as an artist. But before he left, he also made this work, 1968 Fishman, where you can barely see on the bottom of this table here of himself, again, cast in wax with fish. Here's a close-up view of the Fishman. Now, the fish is associated with rebirth and regeneration. In the myth of Osiris, as I've mentioned, Osiris is the god who is torn apart and his pieces are thrown in various directions. One of those pieces, his phallus, is thrown into a river and it's swallowed up by a fish. Basically, it gives birth, as it were, in the Old Testament when Jonah comes out of the whale's belly. That's essentially the birth of the dove. The name Jonah means dove, and the dove, of course, is one of the great signifiers associated with the Holy Spirit and hence with Christ, with whom the dove is consubstantial. And Christ is, of course, later the great fish god, the one who makes men, who is the fisher of men. He fishes men out of the waters of ignorance and brings them into the light of spiritual illumination. And he is also the great god of the Magnus Annus, the god of Pisces, the age of the fish, and the fish meal on Friday that the Catholic tradition celebrates. And Paul Tech did come out of the Catholic tradition. So here he is celebrating a resurrection of himself after he buries himself in the tomb. And in this later image from his later period, Tower and Uncle Tom's Cabin from 1976, which is basically, we see him continuing the tradition of hybridizing signifiers from the collective unconscious, as it were. He's taking the myth of the Tower of Babel and sort of combining it with the tower at Watts in Los Angeles. It looks sort of like that anyway. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, and creating this vision of a hybridized signifier, which is the essence of what he did as an artist. And so Tech was always trying to find depth. He was a New York artist, one of the greatest, I think, and his reputation is becoming better and better known as time goes by. And I just wanted to introduce him here in this very quick flyby sketch to give the reader a sense that there is another artist in here that exhibited with this group of pop artists who had depth to him in a way that is very spiritually interesting. Tech died in 1988 at the age of 54 of AIDS, and there was an exhibition of him in Barcelona, I think, in 1995, and then a retrospective at the Whitney, as I've said, in 2010. And so his work is now beginning to get the recognition that it deserves. And I think that his work is really only perhaps third in importance to contemporary art after that of Marcel Duchamp and Joseph Beuys.